Good morning. This is WBOR 91.1 FM. Hello, Brunswick, Maine, Cumberland County, all the way around the world. My name is Roger Wilder. It is 9 a.m. on a Thursday, which means it is time for Bear Tracks, a show that I co-lead, co-DJ with another John Erlinson, the senior here at Bowdoin, where we talk about different ecological topics, different animals, different principles of wildlife biology, hoping to educate people about these different topics, but also hoping to excite people to look at the world in a new, novel way, to get outside and to experience the wonders of nature for themselves firsthand. I have another show on Tuesday mornings called Title Tracks. That's from 10 to 11, where I play a different genre of music every week. So if you want to check out that show, I recommend that as well. We did surf rock earlier this week, a lot of cars, a lot of surfing, a lot of rock and roll. Before that, I believe some classic rock. Before that, even Frank Sinatra. So a very wide range if you want to check that out. Today, again, I'm usually with John Erlinson. He's another senior here at Bowdoin. We're both biology majors. I'm from New Mexico. He's from Minnesota. And he today is gone because, and rightfully so, he is with the Ecology, Evolution, and Marine Biology research class right now, which is the capstone class for all biology majors. He is currently hiking with 15 other students, our teacher, and the Maine Fish and Wildlife Service out into the woods in Maine to look for a hibernating bear and her two cubs for a research program. I was able to do this trip about 2 years ago. Very exciting. He'll be gone pretty much all day. Wish him luck, lots of fun. And while he's gone, I'll be trying to solo this show and thinking about the topics that I could talk about here on my own. Coral reefs were the first thing that came to mind. They are amazing places, things that I am probably most interested in terms of wildlife, although my experience and interest has ranged across my undergraduate years from mummy chugs, which are little saltwater killifish, to plants. I'm doing my honors project on photosynthesis. I've also worked on coral in Florida. I've worked on kelp farms. The nice thing about coral reefs is that they're extremely multidisciplinary. They take into account lots of different interests and pile them into one. And that is because coral reefs are the largest marine ecosystem, although they don't cover largest in diversity of fish and wildlife. They only cover about 1% of the ocean floor in most places. People in Maine, and I'm from New Mexico, so certainly people around my home state as well, and myself included, have very little experience relatively outside of our states exploring coral reefs in their natural habitat. They are extremely complex and very hard to conceptualize without seeing them firsthand. So this show hopes to offer a bit of insight into what coral reefs are, where they're located, what coral are fundamentally. They're extremely interesting and extremely confusing. Where they grow, how they grow, the threats that these face in the wild, and the benefits they pose to humanity and wildlife, and some big picture topics, hopefully to conclude with what you can do moving forward, how you can expand your interest if I've triggered a bit of a light bulb in your head. Without much further ado, let's jump into what coral reefs are. As I've said, they are a pretty highly diverse marine ecosystem made up of tiny animals called coral. Coral can grow to be huge, but they're all made up of small, little organisms called polyps, which grow individually and can multiply. And these coral, as they grow, form the backbones of reef structures. And we'll get more into how they grow and how they do that later on. But coral create a whole ecosystem on their own, and other animals will inhabit this ecosystem and allow it to function at an extremely precise and complex level. Most of the fish in coral reefs are extremely beautiful, and because of that, they have proliferated amongst pop culture. People likely know Nemo, clownfish, Dory, blue tangs, blue hippo tang specifically. Coral reefs are much more abundant in our lives, even if you aren't living in a coastal tropical environment, far more than most people realize. In movies and TV shows, David Attenborough has talked about them ad nauseum, and he isn't even a coral reef specialist. Corals cover, again, about 1% of the world's oceans, almost always in shallow waters. There are some deep water reefs, but I might talk about that a little bit more later. They host about 25% of all marine life at some point in their development, which is astounding. And even more marine life than that 25% rely on coral reefs in some less specific, less focused way, whether that's through diet, eating organisms that have otherwise matured on coral reefs. Coral reefs are also successful for so many other ecosystems and humans in many profound ways, which, again, I will discuss more in a moment. Coral reefs are not found in Maine, at least not the shallow tropical coral reefs that most people think of if they already have an image in their head of this beautiful, colorful habitat just below the waves. They're found across the warm tropical belt around the equator, mostly between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, meaning they prefer warm waters. They don't do very well in cold waters. Again, there are deep water reefs, coral growing below areas of sunlight, but they have very different life histories, very different strategies for survival, and somewhat different threats in the way that they survive, the way that they operate. Thinking about where coral are located, you have, first of all, the Coral Triangle, which I think is probably the area that gets the most attention when it comes to pictures, documentaries, because coral reefs there are, in many cases, still very pristine, in many cases, extremely diverse, especially even for coral reefs, have a high diversity of coral, high diversity of marine life, coming between fish and invertebrates, and so that would be like crabs, lobsters, and even seabirds. So this ecosystem extends beyond just the ocean. The Coral Triangle is a large expanse of shallow reefs. They are found across this area between Malaysia, Indonesia, and other countries, like Brunei, going down to Australia, New Guinea, and the South Pacific, forming this, if you look at a map, this kind of triangulated region of really high reef diversity. They extend in many ways. Most of the reefs in this area are fringing or barrier reefs, and are extremely important to the life histories of other organisms in this area and people. These areas rely heavily on tourism as well, and we'll get into more about that in terms of how coral reefs benefit humanity. But yeah, the countries, other Philippines are also another country there with extremely high coral reef diversity. So this hub is known as the Coral Triangle. Around there, and somewhat relatedly, is the Great Barrier Reef system in northern and northeastern Australia. The Great Barrier Reef is one of the largest single living organisms on the planet. Coral reefs, yes, they're made up of a diversity of organisms, but they fundamentally can be considered, in many ways, one major organism made up of a multitude of polyps. In many cases, coral can expand in such a way that it preserves one major genetic code, and so a coral organism could be huge, but still simply one individual, or have originated from one individual broken off into pieces. We'll talk about that when we cover coral reproduction. Other major hotspots for coral diversity and coral reefs include the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. In the Indian Ocean, you have the Maldives, which is also extremely famous for devil rays and tourism around mantas, which are, again, extremely uncommon but amazing creatures. Genius. Many mantas have been known to approach divers when tangled up in plastic fishing gear in hopes of getting help. So really, really complex organisms, thinking at a very high level, far above, I feel, what most people may anticipate, especially of marine organisms and especially of non-mammals. The area most familiar to people in the U.S. in terms of coral diversity is the Caribbean Sea, which shows coral reefs extending from the southern tip of Florida, from Jupiter and down to Florida Keys. You have Key Largo, Key West, major beds of coral reef activity, and especially of tourism coming from Europe and more so the U.S. You have the Yucatan Peninsula down in Mexico and Belize, with islands like Cozumel and the Palenque Reef showing off extreme diversity in coral habitats, again extending down. But this coral sea is very complex as well. It shows small fringing reefs off of most other islands in the Antillean chain. In this Antillean chain, you have the Greater Antilles extending up into Puerto Rico and ranging up into Cuba and Dominican Republic and the Bahamas. But you also have the Lesser Antilles that circulate down almost into South America, into the tip of Venezuela. You're looking at islands like St. Lucia, Dominica. You're looking at Trinidad and Tobago, Grenada, Barbados. A lot of countries that are very small but still are sovereign and therefore have their own legislature revolving their use of marine systems. And these reefs have formed in this kind of circular ring in shallow waters around this area, as well as into northern South America. The diversity of reefs between the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean, and the Pacific Islands as well, are the last major system I will highlight. You're looking at islands like Vanuatu, the Cook Islands, Pitcairn Islands, quite a bit farther away, French Polynesia, Samoa, Federated States of Micronesia. These countries, again, similarly to the Antillean Islands, which I just mentioned in the Caribbean Sea, are very small, but very widespread. They also bolster significant coral growth in one of the three main types of coral reefs, atoll reefs, and these are quite different than in the Caribbean Sea, but still extremely notable in their own right. The diversity of life between these two systems is very different. And by the two systems, I mean on each side of the Americas, in the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific. The Caribbean Sea has different species overall, but overall less species diversity in terms of coral and in terms of fish and vertebrate diversity. Looking at reefs in the Florida Keys, which I've been very fortunate to spend a good amount of time. I grew up diving there a bit, mostly snorkeling there, and even doing research down there as a college student. So I'm very fortunate to have that opportunity. It's one of the places that's excited me most about coral reefs and their preservation. But the coral reefs there are primarily built by two coral species. Elkhorn coral, which is a branching coral that grows out in a sort of plate shape, and staghorn coral. And these are the common names, of course. Staghorn coral is very similar, very closely related. It grows up in more finger-like growth, still forming this solid carbon backbone of coral reefs in this area. And that's really fundamental to the growth of these structures. When you are considering the Pacific reefs, they have similar species. And again, these two species in the Caribbean are Acropora cervicornis, which is the staghorn coral, the more finger-like coral. And you have Acropora palmata, which is the elkhorn coral, the more plating-like coral. Both of these are kind of light brown in shade, at least in this region. When you cross the Panama Canal, the Isthmus, and go on the other side of Central America, you see a far greater diversity of these reef-building species. There are many types of coral otherwise that are in the Florida Keys, but those are the two primary reef-building coral. You have a variety of other Acropora species, those species that grow in a similar manner to those in the Caribbean Sea, but they look very different. Diving in Okinawa from experience, you see extreme diversity of color. Light blues, reds, pinks. And considering that much of the color in the ocean dissipates as you move deeper, even within the first 10 feet of water, because light penetration doesn't really occur very far down past the surface, especially for certain colors. It's remarkable how beautiful these reefs can be, especially in the Pacific, but in the Caribbean Sea as well. As you move farther, as you move deeper into the water, I mean, you still get the pinks, the reds, and even the blues and greens. There's also significantly, and speaking primarily from Okinawa, that's my main experience diving in the Pacific, and so my only experience, you see a much wider cover of coral reefs, which in the Caribbean Sea, they're naturally just more spotty. A few coral colonies here and there, with still a variety of fish species, but you'll have tangs, surgeonfish, which are these variety of colors, these kind of disc-shaped fish with long trunks. They can shoal in huge numbers on the reef, hundreds, just swarming. And these are generally, the Caribbean Sea generally sees these sort of fish, other wrasses too, which are long, skinny fish, migrating from one of these patches of reef to another. Where in many places around Okinawa and some of the Pacific Islands as well, you have these large expanses of reef with fish just popping out of holes here and there everywhere, circulating. In the United States, there are only two main areas where you can see coral. That is, again, in South Florida, the Florida Keys, Jupiter, areas kind of around Miami, and in Hawaii. So not even in the lower 48, but Hawaii, being a chain of Pacific islands, has great expansive reef at Waimea Bay, ranging from their Big Island, where one of my old coral mentors now works in coral restoration, to the island of Oahu, beaches and coral reefs around Honolulu. I've talked a lot about the coral reef habitat as a whole, but to really appreciate how coral reefs grow, it's important to view the coral as an individual organism and its life history. Coral are animals. They are often confused with plants, I feel, and in many cases are also referred to as rocks. And so, but coral are animals. They do not have a brain. They do not have extremely complex internal organs like most mammals or other fish, but the way in which they grow is much more animal-based than plants, which you will appreciate, I think, as we dig a little bit deeper into a coral structure. Coral have mouths, and they, unlike a plant, they cannot photosynthesize on their own, which, though they do rely heavily on sunlight as a source of food. If you were to ask me whether corals are plants, animals, or minerals, though I've already told you they're animals, I would say that in some ways they're all three. Corals are animals. They do need to feed, and they cannot produce their own energy through sunlight, though they have ways of getting around this. And by that, I mean they are partnered with specific types of algae known as dinoflagellates. And everyone has seen algae before. If this isn't something you can picture, think of green pond scum. Think of, if you've ever been to an aquarium, any of the green or brown or red kind of slime growing on the glass. That is algae, is a plant. They're made up of small microorganisms called phytoplankton in the ocean, which produce energy based on photosynthesis. They take up light and carbon dioxide as a proxy, and they use that to create energy in the form of sugars and release oxygen for us to breathe, for all organisms to breathe on an atmospheric level in response. Again, the plants, their primary goal is to create energy for themselves. Oxygen is a byproduct. But coral partners with a specific type of algae known as dinoflagellates, or specifically zooxanthellae. And this algae grows in a coral's tissue. The algae will, because the coral cannot, the algae will photosynthesize, taking up light and producing sugars and oxygen. The dinoflagellates, the zooxanthellae, will then hand some of this product, algae and primarily sugars, to the coral, which the sugars will utilize as a source of food. And the coral, in turn, will provide waste, so uneaten food or fecal matter in terms of nitrogen to the dinoflagellate algae in response, which allows them to feed, grow, and develop and continue to photosynthesize. So there's this very deep symbiotic and mutualistic relationship occurring, which kind of grays the area in how coral develop and really makes them a very complex organism. So in this way, again, they are not plants, but they do have a photosynthetic symbiotic relationship, a relationship in which they prosper alongside the algae with which they are partnered to utilize photosynthesis as a source of food. It's for this reason that coral are primarily found in shallow reefs around the world, in areas of high sunlight, because if they were any deeper, the dinoflagellate algae would likely not have the sunlight necessary to photosynthesize, and the coral, which relies upon this algae, would likely be significantly less successful. Coral are very slow-growing animals anyway, so it is highly imperative that they are in areas where they can have high productivity in terms of the food they produce and the photosynthesis that the algae with which they're partnered conduct. Again, corals are colonial animals made up of tiny organisms called polyps, which proliferate and grow as the coral expands. Each of these polyps on a single coral head will have the same genetic makeup, which means that all these polyps, though they can be considered in some ways individual organisms, they are all exact copies of one another, which band together to form these extremely large complexes of grand coral structures on which coral reefs rely to form complex ecosystems that can cover large expanses of area in certain regions. I have a background, yes, in biology, which I'm still developing here at Bowdoin, but also a background in the aquarium hobby, starting with freshwater and migrating into saltwater, I think around 14 years old, middle school. And so much of my perspective on coral, especially growing up in New Mexico, as I didn't have a ton of access to coastal habitats, comes from the aquarium hobby and the coral that I've interacted with working at a fish store, a marine hobby shop back in Albuquerque, New Mexico. There I was responsible in part for hundreds of different marine organisms, ranging from complex coral to fish of a variety of sizes, frankly. The most impressive, I think, being moray eels, lionfish. So really a wide diversity, and that opportunity really granted me new insight and a strong foundation in coral biology that I could take moving into wilder habitats, if you want to use the Roger Wilder pun, as so many of my friends always do. Coral, though, and in this aquarium hobby, coral are primarily categorized in two ways, and this doesn't necessarily extend to science as far as I know, at least in terms of in the context in which I have been placed. There are hard and soft coral. This essentially defines the ways in which these coral varieties develop. Hard corals take in carbonate from the water in a way similar to mollusks or gastropods like snails or other shellfish, and they utilize this carbonate, which is floating around in the water column, invisible to the naked eye for humans, to synthesize these large carbon skeletons, over which they develop skin, tissue, this relationship with dinoflagellates, and branch out. So coral have, in many cases, the hard coral especially, like the elkhorn and staghorn coral I was referring to earlier in the Keys, develop a very strong carbonate skeleton, which allows for the framework for their construction later on. Soft corals are a bit different. They multiply in the same way. They can grow in a very similar way, except they do not utilize carbonate in the water column in the same way. Much of these corals are more closely related to anemones. Coral are cnidarians, so they're related to jellyfish, anemones, gorgonians, which is another really complex type of deep sea, more often deep sea, but not necessarily soft bodied coral-esque creature. It's very hard to explain, especially without images. But essentially, soft corals are more closely related to anemones in that they don't develop this carbonate skeleton. In some cases, soft corals can even move. In the case of mushroom coral, again, mushroom coral in the aquarium hobby are considered coral, likely more similar to anemones, that they're able to walk around. These coral are markedly, at least in the aquarium hobby and most likely in the wild, much faster growing. They photosynthesize at likely a rate similar to, their algae photosynthesize at a rate likely similar to larger stony coral in the wild, but they just proliferate quite a bit faster. And this is because they use asexual reproduction in a much more complex way, in a much faster way, really, than sexual reproduction, at least in captivity, as is easily observed. It's also important to mention that dinoflagellates give coral the striking colors that they have, and we'll get more into that when I talk about coral bleaching later. The dinoflagellates create the pinks, the purples, the blues, the greens, which you'll see if you just look up coral reef online, and the picture is likely photoshopped to show their true colors, their true brightness. That is what you'll see online, is the complex relationship between dinoflagellates really being presented in this rainbow of colors. Corals primarily have two modes of reproduction. They can produce both sexually and asexually, which is pretty fascinating, and a marked trait of some organisms that, in some ways, in terms of internal organs and again a brain, could lack the complexity in humans, but in many other ways are far more complex and difficult to understand than mammals or macroorganisms that we see here. Sexual reproduction occurs essentially on nights, especially those of full moons, late into the austral summer. So in the northern hemisphere, again, you might see this around Florida, Hawaii, you are looking at late July and August. And in the southern hemisphere, Australia, some areas in the Pacific Ocean, essentially the Cook Islands and Polynesia, you're looking at December, potentially, later months. So again, December in the southern hemisphere is their summer. It's very warm. Unlikely to see snow in Australia, especially northern Australia, around Christmas, I would say. But on these nights, coral will set, which means they prepare their reproductive materials and will release them all at once into the water column. So the air, the sea is just filled with coral eggs floating around. And these reproductive cells will all mix in the water column and form tiny micro coral organisms that will float around the ocean and will set down onto rocky areas, especially those surrounding other coral with which they share at least species, and in some cases more other complex relationships, and that's a bit much to get into here, I think, for this general overview. But they also will set down on rocks specifically covered in a pink encrusting algae. At least this is true in Florida, and there are different varieties of this algae around the globe, known as coralline algae. This algae in some way sets a signal for baby corals, microscopic planktonic corals, to set. And corals will then latch onto this rock permanently with an adhesive glue, like substance, again, oversimplifying here in some ways, but they will then begin to grow up from this rock. And coral are extremely slow growing, but hard coral especially are slow growing. They will continue to grow on this rock, gradually, if they're hard coral, taking in carbonate from the water column to produce the structure that will allow them to grow. And they also, after about, this is very species dependent, but after a certain amount of time, potentially a few weeks, potentially more, will take up dinoflagellate algae into their tissue and develop this symbiotic relationship. So this is not something that they are born with. Dinoflagellate algae, the zooxanthellae with which they interact, on which they rely, is something that they can take up or spit out throughout their lifetime, which is in some ways an evolutionary advantage, in some ways very much not, in the terms of coral bleaching. And there are many problems facing coral, but we really need to cover this, I think, this background on reproduction first before we move on. So that primarily highlights sexual reproduction. It's extremely hard to prompt sexual reproduction of corals in laboratory settings, but many researchers are tackling this now, especially at Mote Marine Laboratory in the Florida Keys, where I worked about 2 summers ago now. Feels like it was yesterday. Also feels like centuries ago. I feel so old as a senior these days. But anyway, and the people there working have used a variety of different strategies to try to maximize sexual reproduction for specifically staghorn and elkhorn coral in laboratory settings. And that has had pretty phenomenal success, but naturally different species have different restrictions, especially for breeding in lab settings. So there's constantly more work to be done in this area. More quickly, and coral also reproduce asexually. And that essentially means that instead of releasing reproductive cells, like eggs and sperm, into the water column, and this can be done in aquarium hobbies intentionally by just breaking off a piece of a hard coral, re-gluing it to a new part of the rock, and letting it grow. Soft corals are even easier. They can just rip apart, essentially, and resettle down on rocks. Coral, again, I've said, can share the same genetic makeup, but with other coral pieces, if they originally are from the same colony, the same head. So essentially you have, let's say you have an elkhorn coral, that kind of plating coral I talked about earlier, and you snap off a piece and you glue it to another piece of the rock. Those pieces of coral will both grow independently, both with the exact same genetic code. So fundamentally, they are exactly the same. They are different pieces of the same organism. They are identical in likely coloration in many ways, identical in physical structure. And again, it is very difficult to tell apart specific coral. It's not like looking at, your two of your friends and saying these are different. I mean, even if coral do have the same genetic makeup, they can look strikingly similar. Color is not always a good measure by which to tell a coral species, or an individual coral. But coral that split from the same host look extremely similar, especially. This has some benefits and some downsides. Asexual reproduction allows for much faster growth of coral. You stick them onto rocks, and they will just kind of proliferate. But when you have too much of genetic overlap, then if you don't mix your genetics across different organisms, you will have a buildup eventually, evolutionarily, over potentially millions of years, of bad DNA patches, essentially of bad mutations in your genetic code that will eventually decrease your overall fitness and really threaten your survival. And I mean, essentially, it's when organisms inbreed, they develop these bad traits that kind of are passed from generation to generation, And because there are no new sets of genes coming in from other groups of other organisms within the species, it's very hard to kind of break out of this, to develop new good traits that can counteract the bad traits. So there are trade-offs. You really don't want to focus primarily, if you're a coral, on asexual reproduction, because though it is a benefit to you and that you're able to spread your specific genetic code and grow at a faster rate than you might be able to when you sexually reproduce, you also are somewhat limiting yourselves. By undergoing sexual reproduction in the wild, you are able to share some of your genetics with the genetics of other coral of your species in the area and have good mixing to produce strong new offspring to continue at least part of your genetic lineage down for more and more generations, which, of course, as a coral is important to you. Animals, in many cases, are not really altruistic about this. Their goal is to survive and ultimately pass on their genetics to new generations to keep their lineage alive. But in a larger scheme of things, coral reefs and the myriad species that rely on them, from organisms of fish to invertebrates, rely heavily on the fact that coral reproduction is complex and is multifaceted. So without sexual and asexual reproduction, a mix of both, coral reefs would simply not be as successful for the coral's sake or for the other organism's sake, and frankly, for human sake as well, as if they were to choose one route. Again, coral reproduction sexually has its own downsides. You know, eggs and sperm may not mix in the water column in good ways, especially as algae has been growing faster over reefs in response to warmer temperatures in some areas. It's harder for small, tiny planktonic coral to find patches in which this coral and pink algae is growing, and so it's harder for them to set. So in some cases, asexual reproduction does pose some benefits, especially moving into the modern era. We have a few more topics I would like to cover here, especially talking about the different types of coral reefs and why they're important to humanity, because in so many ways it's easy to overlook the benefits these organisms show us. They're amazing, they're beautiful. I could talk for hours simply about why we should protect them outside of the roles in which they contribute to humanity, but in so many cases, especially when corals are far away and organisms are not very accessible to people, there needs to be some kind of incentive, some kind of so what. So I hope to offer you that as well. We'll take a quick break here. Again, you're listening to WBOR 91.1 FM. Thank you so much for tuning in, whether you are here on WBOR.org on the other side of the globe. And if you are, I hope you have a different perspective on coral reefs even than I have. Or if you were listening on WBOR 91.1 FM here in the Mid-Coast area, where there are no tropical shallow coral reefs, I hope you are enjoying, and I appreciate you for being here. Thank you. I'll be back in just about a minute or two.
With recent reports showing that the world is not on track to meet climate targets, it's time to take action on climate change. The IPCC and over 3,600 economists call for a carbon fee and dividend legislation. A national carbon fee and dividend would put the U.S. on track to reaching net zero carbon emissions by 2050, while financially benefiting low-income and marginalized communities. Bowdoin students are taking part in a national movement calling on Congress to enact this policy and invite you to ask your representatives to support a carbon fee and dividend. This announcement is a public service of WBOR 91.1 FM.
Who doesn't want a shiny new electronic device? Sure, back home there's a garage or a basement full of old electronics that we don't talk about. But old electronics aren't garbage, and they're not useless. They're full of parts and materials that can be recycled into new electronics or donated to some wonderful causes. That flip phone and old computer can still live on. Recycling electronics is the green thing to do. It's the right thing to do, and it's so easy. Log on to greenergadgets.org and enter your zip code to find the recycling center nearest you.
Alrighty, I am back. Again, my name is Roger Wilder. You're listening to WBOR 91.1 FM. Thank you for sticking with me through those public service announcements. We'll move along about 24 minutes here, jumping back into coral reefs and starting with the three primary types of reefs. So we've talked about how corals grow, how they develop, how they survive and feed, and also how they build reef structures. Looking at the different varieties of reef structures, there are primarily three to focus on that are found throughout the world. First, you have fringing reefs, which are the most common. They essentially grow out like a shelf, moving away from the beaches of most islands and shorelines. So you'll have sandy beach, maybe a little bit of a drop off, and then coral starts to proliferate. Most coral reefs are found within 30 feet of water, especially these shallow tropical reefs. Again, not talking here about the deep water, like chemical reefs that are very, very different. Soft coral reefs are very different than those found in these areas. So fringing reefs will eventually develop and then likely fade out as we move farther away from shore into deeper water. But they build, again, like they sound, kind of in a fringe around coastal habitats and coastal communities, whether on islands or along coastlines of larger masses of water, or larger bodies of land, so Florida Keys or others. Next up, you have barrier reefs, which are similar to fringing reefs. They grow along shorelines as well, but usually a bit farther away, and they build much larger barrier wall-like structures than fringing reefs. And the largest being, the Great Barrier Reef of Australia, which covers miles and miles and miles of coastline. Fringing reefs can do so similarly, but the barrier reef design develops these really complex pathways, chambers, and structures with which in years of growth have designed complex holes and crevices in which fish can occupy and develop, which can be explored by divers as well. So barrier reefs and fringing reefs, both similar, fairly common fringing reefs, less common barrier reefs, but both mass coral structures in open water habitats and coastal communities. The last main type of reefs, which are common around mostly islands, I would say in the South Pacific, areas of high volcanic activity, you have atoll reefs. Most people, I think, can reference atolls from anything they know about the Pacific, potentially in World War II, or traveling there, looking at images. You have these islands that kind of rose out of the sea in response to volcanic activity eons ago. And these reefs, these islands have seen the development of coral reefs generally in rings around them. If you've seen any pictures of areas like Midway Atoll or French Polynesia or Fiji, you'll see potentially a small island surrounded by a ring of really, really light water with patches of dark, and then a drop off into more of the pelagic open ocean as you move away from these areas. The light area patched with dark is a combination of sand beds and coral reefs. So you can see those from the air. The Great Barrier Reef, in fact, moving away from atoll reefs briefly, is so large it can be seen from outer space, from satellite imagery. So really, if you think about how small scale a single coral polyp is and how small it is in comparison to the larger a larger colony and then to a larger reef as a whole, it's pretty astounding as to how these organisms can build such complex structures. A little bit of a fun fact I just learned yesterday, thinking about this show. The word atoll was originally coined in English by Charles Darwin in his explorations, likely around the Galapagos. It originally came from a Malay word, meaning, kind of reef structure. They're fairly common in the Pacific, in both the South and in southern Japan, Okinawa, and the Ryukyu Islands in that area. All three of these reef types contribute very heavily to the planet. Again, they make up about 1%, coral make up about 1% of marine areas, about 1% of the seafloor, really. Think about it in that way. But they are extremely fundamental. Ecosystems on the coast in general are very important. This ranges from mangrove habitats, which are a special type of marine tree that is designed to live in coastal and ocean environments. You have salt marshes, which are pretty prolific through Maine. You have seagrass beds. You have kelp forest. All of these communities are fundamental to our survival, whether we are on the coast and are interacting more closely with them, or whether we live in landlocked states like New Mexico and don't often see their impacts firsthand. They all are pretty similar in much of their benefits, but looking at coral reefs specifically, I'll highlight a few for you today. They are extremely productive places in terms of fishing. This is true for indigenous groups. In many places, this is true for large-scale fisheries management, according to NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration here in the United States. Roughly half of fisheries species, so not specifically, but in a broader sense, talking about salmon, talking about herring, talking about mackerel, talking about snapper, these species all rely on coral reefs at some point in their development. Salmon likely don't make it to coral reefs as much, although these species are reliant upon both marine habitats and freshwater habitats in their lifetime. But if you look at a reef, and I was over in Florida, I was with a buddy named Sal, who's a big fisherman, and just talking to him about the species he sees there. I mean, when he jumps in the water, he loves coral. He's a marine biologist himself, but he sees just this diversity of life in terms of fishing. You see yellowtail snappers down in Florida, you see grouper, you see tarpon, all these things that are both a sports fisherman's dream, but also fish that are extremely important to people that rely on fishing to sustain themselves and to offer them some food. Coral reefs break waves during storms, which is especially important for coastal communities. Again, being from New Mexico, it's hard to potentially picture a hurricane, at least for me it is. I haven't really been in an intense tropical storm. But when waves are crashing onto the shore 10, 20 feet above normal, people have coral reefs often, in tropical places certainly, to thank for breaking those waves and in many cases protecting those coastal areas. In small islands, storm surge can get so bad waves can roll over the island as a whole and completely flood it out. Coral reefs often are imperative in stopping this. They also can contribute to the prevention of sea level rise in a similar way. Turns out that 40%, I learned this yesterday as well, 40% of people in America live on the coast. Not necessarily tropical coastlines, but if not coral reefs, some other coastal habitat, again, salt marshes, mangroves, are protecting you in some way from breaking waves during storms and sea level rise. So coral reefs and other coastal habitats are indelibly linked to our survival as a species, as in humanity. Pairing with the prevention of breaking waves, immense tourism industries are reliant upon coral reefs. That is true in the U.S., that is true all over the world. Learn Florida brings millions and millions of dollars in every year just through scuba diving and commercial fishing, which is an industry that simply would not exist without the help of coral reefs. The same is true in Hawaii, and for many nations, especially like those in the Caribbean Sea, where their primary source of income is through ecotourism. I'm thinking here about Cuba, thinking in many ways about the Dominican Republic. They rely heavily on coral reefs. The people in these areas rely heavily on coral reefs to live their lives and to have an income at all. So, certainly a financial incentive to thinking about the protection of these organisms as well. Coral also, over time, breaks down into sand. Most organisms that utilize carbonate to form structures will, after they die, either be broken down to smaller pieces by the natural process of aging and wear to contribute to sandy beaches. And of course, this is a process that takes place over millions or billions of years. But it's certainly, again, we have coral reefs to thank for any sandy beach vacations that we like to take. There are also many fish on reefs, like triggerfish, or more specifically parrotfish, that will eat coral and break it down. And again, coral's extremely slow going. It can take 50 to 100 years to get a nice hard coral structure, like an elkhorn or staghorn coral colony. But these fish eating it is the natural order of things. They can break down the coral in their stomach and then release it as waste in the form of sand, which again contributes to sand beds and sandy beaches. It's also important to note that cures for many diseases come from coral reefs. There have been different cancer treatments that have come from research in coral microbiology. There have been a variety of other diseases as well that have either been treated or cured from coral reefs, and many scientists believe there are still much more potential treatments out there. Coral reefs are not only so complex, they're considered the Amazon of the ocean, the jungles of the sea, rainforests of the sea in many ways, not because only of the fish and crabs and octopi and sea stars and coral that you see firsthand when you're diving, but also for the multitude, the myriad small organisms like bacteria and microalgae that are responsible for so many of the inner workings of these systems. They are found throughout these reefs, are easily overlooked, of course, because you can't see them with the naked eye. But when you take a research-focused perspective, diving a little bit more deeply into the reefs, you will see that, in fact, there is quite a bit more there than meets the eye, and quite a bit that can offer humanity, especially as we pursue the development of the medical field. And lastly, and this is certainly not the last benefit of coral reefs to humanity and the world, but I would like to highlight a few major ones here. They also, because they photosynthesize, can take in carbon through photosynthesis with this coral dinoflagellate relationship, coral algae symbiotic relationship, to mitigate negative climate effects. They, however, are extremely, and by they I mean coral and coral colonies on coral reefs, are extremely impacted by climate change. And though they're doing their part to try to mitigate it, they simply are not doing it fast enough. You can't rely on 1% of the seafloor being coral reefs to protect themselves from negative climate effects, which is a major, major threat. About 10 more minutes here. I'd like to cover threats. So highlight a few organizations I've already discussed a bit briefly that are working on coral reefs, and give some final thoughts as to what you can do. Again, in terms of threats, corals take years to grow, especially hard coral. 50 to 100 years for a nice elkhorn coral colony, potentially. And this can be especially hindered by coastal development, chemical runoff from large industries, and overall unethical boating or human use, irresponsible boating or human use. The amount of times that I've heard about a boat going to snorkel or scuba dive and dropping anchor onto a large coral colony, it is unfortunate, somewhat astounding, and also painful. And it is by no means the person's fault in many cases. I think there's simply it's easy to be unaware, especially when you are out on the water. But talking about coral reefs, talking about their importance, talking about the dangers they face, hopefully can give people a little bit of a better perspective if they are boating around tropical areas. It is so easy to accidentally damage a coral, especially if you don't know much about it. And I will consistently avoid casting blame on anyone for anything that's happening small scale to coral reefs, especially when you don't know much about them. So the key, I think, is ultimately education. Try to talk more about what impacts coral reefs, how we can protect them as individuals, and hopefully lead to more responsible small scale behaviors like responsible boating, human use of these systems, responsible fishing. But again, these are the major threats, especially in highly urbanized and developed areas. Luckily, many of the small islands in the Pacific, many of them are even uninhabited. These islands are not very developed. And for coral, this is beneficial, though there is this constant struggle between, I think, balancing industrialization for the success of people who live in certain areas and for protection of wildlife. And that's something that I think is constantly being juggled back and forth. But yes, coastal development, chemical runoff, unethical boating, and human use are major threats to coral reefs. Overall, and there are other smaller effects, the aquarium hobby is extremely important. I've benefited quite a bit from it. It can offer a lot of great insight to individuals when learning about the sea, but irresponsible collection for the aquarium hobby in the wild can devastate coral reefs as well. Corals are found in 109 countries, and 93 of these countries are contributing to coral decline, either through industrialization, chemical runoff, human influence. So it's a very prolific issue. It is not any one group or one country that is primarily to blame here. It is very widespread. Plastic pollution is also another big issue. Abandoned fishing gear getting wrapped up in coral, it's another big problem. The biggest problem, though, in big picture, and I've mentioned this briefly before, is climate change. Coral reefs can take out carbon in the atmosphere to mitigate climate change, but they are simply not doing enough. They can't do enough. It's a team effort to try to fix these issues. But essentially, climate change increases the temperature of the sea, and not to mention the other impacts it has on ecosystems around the world. But a 1 to 2 degree Fahrenheit temperature change in the ocean is significant. It may not feel that way to us when we get in the water, maybe a little bit warmer, may even feel nice in some cases, Maine water being a little bit warmer, especially for me. I'm a bit of a wuss, so that's always good for me. But if you're a coral, a 1 to 2 degree change is significant. For human beings, you have a resting temperature around 98, 98.7 or so. If you have a 2 degree temperature increase, you're at 100 degrees, you're at a fever. I've heard this idea of climate change and coral reefs been put in these terms before. If coral are in water that is increased by about 2 degrees above what they are used to experiencing, they essentially, they don't have a fever, but they're not doing very well. And in response, coral will collect all of their dinoflagellate algae in their tissues, and they'll spit it out. They'll say, gross, I've got to try something to mitigate this heat stress that I'm feeling, and they spit all this algae out, and they turn white. If any of you have ever heard the term coral bleaching, this is where it comes from. Coral are not dead when they have been bleached. They have simply just parted with the algae that offers them sugars and a source of food through photosynthesis, and lost all their coloration through this, which is why they turn white. And coral, like I said, can take up algae. They can release algae in this way. If the stressors for coral are removed, coral can regain its dinoflagellate algae and start to benefit from photosynthesis again and to start to grow. However, if after a set amount of time, and this is likely different per habitat, per stressor, per coral, if they do not regain the dinoflagellate algae that they have parted with, the white coral, which can live on its own for a while because they can feed themselves through mouths, they don't simply rely on photosynthesis, they will eventually die, leaving behind these calcareous carbonate skeleton structures that provide no function really ecologically to the species, at least not in the same way that living reefs provide to fish and humanity. It is, again, as individuals, we can focus more on these small scale things and do what we can to mitigate climate change, but this is big picture. This is a worldwide issue. Luckily, there are a variety of organizations working to study coral reefs and try to boost their resilience. One of these being Mote Marine Laboratory, which has been extremely influential throughout my life, from summer camps back in middle school to taking me on as a research intern in college, to the development of my interest in coral reefs and also to the contributions they make to science and coral restoration. Some of the work they're doing, one of the researchers there kind of coined the idea of coral microfragmentation specifically for coral restoration. And basically what that means is you take a hard coral, you cut it into smaller pieces, and you glue them to frag plugs, which are like little plugs you can stick onto rocks. And whether you're letting these coral grow in the wild or in captivity, this researcher found, David Vaughan, that coral cut into smaller pieces will grow 4 times as fast as coral in one large colony. The principle behind this is essentially, if you fall and scrape your knee while biking, the scab tissue that covers your wound is going to grow and heal significantly faster than other skin tissue in areas where you don't have injury. So when a coral is cut, naturally they don't scab over in the same way we do, but the area of their wound will grow and heal faster and prompt quicker coral growth. So utilizing this strategy in a restoration sense, you can take coral out of the sea, cut it into smaller pieces, and ensuring that all these pieces individually survive, you can have the coral grow significantly faster in a multitude of fragments, and then place it back together, place it back near each other, the fragments near each other on reefs, and allow them to reconnect, which is really fascinating. So essentially, you have just, by breaking a coral into smaller pieces, you've made a large coral structure faster than the coral could have made that structure growing on its own without any fragmentation. There's a lot of disease research there, which, although my mentor, Grace Klingus, I'm not sure if she's listening right now, is no longer with Mote. She still, I'm sure, collaborates highly with them. Just a lot of research on coral diseases and how, when I was with her, we were working on how corals spit out. When they spit out and part ways with their dinoflagellates, they're also parting ways with coral diseases. So essentially, these researchers were looking at methods of essentially triggering coral to kick out their dinoflagellate algae in order to kick out negative bacteria, and then nursing them back to health so they can take up this algae without the bad bacteria and then placing them back out on reefs. We also were trying to study where the coral could take up good bacteria as it takes up its dinoflagellate algae to make it overall more resilient to negative bacteria in the wild. So another strategy of trying to boost coral resilience out on the reefs. There also is high management of genetic areas, of genetic information on these coral to kind of maximize the efficiency. Again, I talked about this briefly already, so I'll brush over it a little bit here. I'm running out of time, unfortunately, but coral sexual reproduction is being instigated in lab settings here at Mote, especially in the summer, to bolster coral resilience and to bolster the amount of genetic mixing that's happening that can be introduced into the wild. And other research there focuses on king crabs and lobster as methods of eating algae that can negatively impact reefs to kind of clear spaces for reefs and clear spaces for new sexual recruits of little corals, a tiny micro baby coral, to resettle on stone structures. I have about 4 minutes left here, 2 minutes now, to discuss kind of the last overall thoughts I'd like to offer on this show. What can we do as individuals? I think the most important thing wherever we live on the planet in regards to coral reefs is simply take an interest. Go to a local aquarium, a local marine lab if that is accessible to you. Go to the coast if you can. Just think a little bit more critically about the environment. Pay coral reefs, coastal habitats, and all other wildlife a bit of a closer look. If you are really interested in coral reefs and think they're the coolest thing, which I certainly do, if I've inspired even a little bit of that interest in you today, go get scuba certified. You can do it in every state, whether you're on the coast. It's a bit more fun when you're diving in the open ocean, but I got certified in the tiny New Mexico town of Santa Rosa in an 80-foot deep ice-cold sinkhole. So those options are accessible to you as well, if you're willing to take the time to learn and to invest energy into that. And to read books by people like Rachel Carson, who she's most famous for Silent Spring, that's her book commenting on DDT and chemicals, but also did a lot of work with coastal habitats. So I simply implore you, don't think of coral reefs as ecosystems, think of them as cities. They are complex areas, not just of high diversity, but if you look closely, you'll realize that coral are buildings, and they provide the foundation for a whole network of organisms. When you look at a reef and you really think about it, fish are moving around in ways that are very similar to humans. In neighborhoods, they have jobs, they have responsibilities, all trying to feed their families, feed themselves. And you think about it that way, coral reefs really open up to be something truly amazing, especially to humans. So simply, if you tuned in for part of this show, if you're just catching me now or have been here all along, I hope I inspired you to look a bit more closely. Again, this is Bear Tracks. My name is Roger Wilder. And just to wrap